In the last few decades, obesity has been becoming more and more of a problem for countries around the world. Here in the UK, the problem has been more acute than others, with the Institute for Government describing it as a chronic problem. The UK is by no means a poor country, and it's had time to course correct. So how bad is the situation in the UK? What's caused the problems? And what can the government do to fix it? Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. It's important to stress from the outset that all countries have been struggling with this problem in recent years. Most countries in the G20, for example, have seen an increase of between 11 and 25% of obese people since 1975. The UK's data roughly fits within this range. In England, since 1993, the percentage of adults with obesity has basically doubled, from 15 to 28% in 2019. Interestingly, over half of this increase occurred between 1993 and 2001. The picture looks similar for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, although Wales and Northern Ireland generally have lower rates of obesity to England. The difference in who suffers the most from obesity in the UK is not just limited to region either. It appears that one of the starkest differences in obesity comes from deprivation quintiles. Almost 70% of those in the most deprived quintile are either overweight or living with obesity. This is vastly different to the 59% of those in the least deprived quintile. This divide appears to be widening too, with the percentage difference in obesity between the least and most deprived deciles rising from 8.2% to 9.4% in the last 5 years. Unfortunately, this disparity also exists in children, and has been widening also. In 2007-2008, 22.3% of people in Year 6 in the most deprived decile were obese. This increased by just shy of 10% to just 31.3% in 2021-2022. In the least deprived decile back in 2007-2008, only 12.7% of those in Year 6 in the least deprived decile were obese. This increased only to 13.5% in 2021-2022, which is not even a 1% increase. Now, it's obvious that this is far from desirable, but even aside from the moral considerations here, there's evidence that this has further effects on wider society. Obesity-related healthcare costs the NHS about £6.5 billion per year. In fact, the total societal costs of obesity have been estimated somewhere in the £29 billion to £58 billion range, which is roughly about 1 to 2% of GDP. So it's clear that obesity is a problem in the UK, and the problem appears linked to deprivation. This problem is not just a moral issue in the UK, it affects the economy. So it's worth now turning to have a look at the factors that affect obesity in the UK, starting with why obesity is so heavily linked to deprivation. Now, obviously, one of the main links between obesity and deprivation is the cost of food. In the last few decades, the production of food has changed dramatically. Far more so-called superabundance foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt are now available. The thing about these foods is that they're cheap. They're made with ingredients that have a long shelf life. So, in essence, because they provide a lot of calories for very little money, they've become increasingly popular. In addition to this, more modern working and living patterns have increased the prevalence of snacking. Healthy foods, on the other hand, are more expensive. Henry Dimbleby, who wrote a review for Michael Gove when he was Environment Secretary, described this as the junk food cycle. In essence, as the food industry struggles to sell healthy food, it becomes increasingly difficult for wider society to be healthy. It becomes easy then to see how poor economic prospects tie in with obesity and how the two reinforce each other. Poor health slows economic productivity, which then in turn reduces household income, which reduces consumption of expensive healthy food, which makes people more unhealthy, and so on and so on. In essence, we've been in this feedback loop for the last few decades. So let's move on and have a look at some of the ways that the UK government could go about fixing this problem. Now, it's worth noting that previous governments have actually tried to address the problem. In fact, the Institute for Government has put together this graphic demonstrating all the different attempts made, including things like the 2016 soft drinks industry levy and the Change for Life campaign back in 2009. However, the Institute for Government has addressed the main problems in why these policies didn't work. One of the main issues is that the policies have largely focused on individual responsibility. They quote a study from the University of Cambridge that looked at 14 government strategies in England over the last 30 years. They found that the majority made high demands on individual agency. The Institute for Government has acknowledged, though, that there are exceptions. The Blair government, for example, banned adverts of unhealthy food on children's TV. Ultimately, though, while there's some place for policies that focus on individual responsibility, this needs to be complemented by policies that focus more on food producers. And even when these policies are implemented, the Institute for Government noted that they've often been voluntary. So, with this in mind, let's go through the Institute for Government's suggestions for what the government could do differently. The first recommendation is for the government to implement a long-term strategy on obesity, which sets out long and medium-term targets. As part of this, the government should decide on which specific topics to focus on. The Institute for Government also suggests that the government needs to build some sort of consensus on action on food and health. In essence, they argue that in order for policies to be successful, there needs to be agreement both in the political and public sphere. It's been suggested that the government usually shies away from action, as any significant action leads the government to face accusations that they're acting like a nanny state. So, in the future, the government needs to develop a communication strategy so if they are to get the public behind them, they don't face these sorts of criticisms. Finally, the Institute for Government claims that the government should try and strengthen the evidence for obesity policies. In interviewing experts and officials, it's found that there are so-called sticking points about, for example, the role of ultra-processed foods in causing obesity. If the government were to commission reports that could get to the bottom of this, then that would probably be very helpful. All in all, obesity is clearly a particularly acute problem in the UK, and it's clear that various economic factors means that it hits those more deprived harder. There are, though, things that the government can do to try and address this, such as setting clear goals and investing in more research on the topic. And if you want to be more in the loop on various different kinds of topics, make sure you subscribe to TLDR and ring the bell. And if you want even more from TLDR, make sure you check out the rest of the network. You might not know, but we actually have 5 different TLDR channels explaining news from the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world, breaking down the latest developments in the business world, and also running through the day's most important news that you might have missed. TLDR has been doing this for around 6 years now, so to celebrate our anniversary, we'd love it if you subscribed. Not only to this channel, but also any of the others that interest you. They're all linked in the description. Our whole purpose is to make the world around you more understandable, to unpack the confusing parts of the news in a way that's interesting, factual, and entirely non-partisan. So, if that's something you're into, then you have 5 channels to enjoy. Thanks for your support over the last 6 years. It really means a lot.